Good evening. First of all, I want to apologize for this morning. We had some technical difficulties. Computer decided that it needed to update as soon as they turned it on. Excuse me. So we weren't able to broadcast this morning. So I'm at home now. I'm going to do it again. And I hope those of you that generally watch it online will be able to catch this on Facebook or YouTube. Last week we talked about the David sending Absalom away, or him running away to Geshur, and being in he was in uh, exile for about 3 years, and we move into chapter 14 of Second Samuel today, and this is Absalom's return to Jerusalem and how Joab intercedes for Absalom. And then in this section of scripture is probably one of the most profound passages that reveal the gospel of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament that I think there is in the Old Testament. And it's when the widow that Joab sets up to speak to David makes her little spiel to David. So pay attention and look for that. We continue now with chapter 14, verses 1 through 3. So Joab, the son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's heart was concerned about Absalom. And Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman and said to her, please pretend to be a mourner and put on mourning apparel. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but act like a woman who has been in mourning for a long time for the dead. Go to the king and speak to him in the manner, in this manner. So Joab put the words in her mouth. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's heart was concerned about Absalom. So David was obviously troubled by his estranged relationship with Absalom. And Joab, David's chief general, perceived this, and he decided to do something to bring David and Absalom back together. In the case of Absalom and the king, the relationship remained virtually deadlocked. I'm sorry. The relationship remained virtually deadlocked, and David, in the case of Absalom and the king, the relationship remained virtually deadlocked. Neither Joab or neither side of this, either David or Absalom, having neither of them had the spiritual incentive to break this deadlock. Now we know that Joab was fiercely loyal to David, and he may have done this to protect David. Joab figured that it was dangerous to have Absalom stewing away in a distant country, and felt that the safest thing to do was to bring about reconciliation between father and son. But Joab sent to Tekoa and he brought from there this wise woman. Joab decided to soften David's heart toward Absalom by bringing a widow before him with a similar story of estrangement from her son. So then we go to verses 4 through 11. And when the woman of Tekoa spoke to the king, she fell on her face to the ground. and prostrated herself and said, "Help, O king." Then the king said to her, "What troubles you?" And she answered, "Indeed, I am a widow. My husband is dead. Now your maidservant had two sons, and the two fought with each other in the field, and there was no one to part them, but the one struck the other and killed him. And now the whole family has risen up against your maidservant and said, 'Deliver him who struck his brother, that we may execute him for the life of his brother, whom he killed. And we will destroy the heir also.' So they would extinguish my ember that is left and leave to my husband uh, neither name nor remnant on the earth." Then the king said to the woman, "Go to your house, and I will give orders concerning you." And the woman of Tekoa said to the king, "My lord, O king, let the iniquity be on me and my father's house, and the king and his throne be guiltless." So the king said, "Whoever says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall not touch you anymore." Then she said, "Please let the king remember the Lord your God, and do not permit the avenger of blood to destroy any more, lest they destroy my son." And he said, "As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." Help, O king. In ancient Israel, those who felt that their local judges didn't treat them fairly had access to the court of the king himself. "Deliver him who struck your brother or his brother, that we may execute him for the life of his brother whom he killed." Now, the woman of Tekoa referred to the custom of the avenger of blood. The avenger of blood had the responsibility of avenging the death of a member of the family. Now, the cities of refuge that are mentioned in Numbers 35, 9 through 34 were meant to protect someone guilty of manslaughter from being killed by the avenger of blood before the case could be heard properly. As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." Now, this was what the woman and Joab behind her waited to hear. In saying this, David ignored the cause of justice for the sake of family sympathy and loyalty. In personal relationships, it is a good and glorious thing to be generous with forgiveness and mercy when we are wronged. But David had the responsibility as the king and chief judge of Israel. And when he was sorely tempted to neglect that responsibility, he did neglect it. He guaranteed safety at the expense of justice, and immediately the far-sighted woman captured him in her trap. That's a comment by Alan Redpath. Now, several factors made this woman her appeal successful to David. She was a widow, which would invite sympathy. She lived at some distance from Jerusalem, which made it difficult to easily know or inquire about the facts in her case. She was old, which gave more dignity to her story. She wore the clothes of mourning to heighten the effect. And she brought a case of family estrangement to David. She brought a case that was not too similar, lest it would arouse David's suspicions. Verses 12 through 17. Therefore, the woman said, "Please let your maidservant speak another word to my lord the king." And he said, "Say on." So the woman said, why then have you schemed such a thing against the people of God? For the king speaks this thing as one who is guilty, in that the king does not bring his banished one home again. For we will surely die and become like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. Yet God does not take away a life, but he devises means so that his banished ones are not expelled from him. Now, therefore, I have come to speak of this thing to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. And your maidservant said, I will now speak to the king. It may be that the king will perform the request of his maidservant. For the king will hear and deliver his maidservant from the hand of the man who would destroy me and my son together from the inheritance of God. Your maidservant said, the word of my lord the king will now be comforting. For as the angel of God, so is my lord the king in discerning good and evil. And may the Lord your God be with you. The king does not bring his banished son or banished one home again. Now, the woman of Tekoa spoke boldly to David, confronting his sin of not initiating reconciliation with Absalom, because he was estranged from David and growing more and more bitter. Absalom was a threat to Israel, and David allowed it. Why, when have you schemed such a thing against the people of God? David had some responsibility to initiate reconciliation. If David approached Absalom, he might be rejected, but he still had the responsibility to try. Yet, as king and chief judge of Israel, he also had a responsibility to both initiate reconciliation and to do it in the right way. David will not succeed in this, as we will see later in the chapter. He is willing to pardon the meanest of his subjects, the murder of a brother at the instance of a poor widow, and he is not willing to pardon, excuse me, he is willing to pardon the meanest of his subjects, the murder of a brother at the instance of a poor widow, and he is not willing to pardon his son Absalom, whose restoration to favor is the desire of the whole nation. We will surely die and become like water spilled on the ground. The woman of Tekoa wisely spoke to David about the urgency of reconciliation. David, we all die, and then the opportunity for reconciliation is over. Do it now. And this reconciliation we're speaking of here applies to our reconciliation with God. We are all estranged from him. And until we reconcile by accepting Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, we are separated from God by our sin. So the urgency is do it now. But he devises means so that his banished ones are not expelled from him. Now, the woman of Tekoa meant find a way to do it, David. God finds a way to bring us back to himself. It is true that God finds a way, but not at the expense of justice. God reconciles us by satisfying justice, not by ignoring justice. And this, as I said earlier, is one of the best gospel texts in the Old Testament. If we are under the chastening of God, we may feel like the banished ones, yet we can put our place of being his banished ones, belonging to him and trusting him to bring us back to him. God has devised a way to bring the banished back to him, that they might not be expelled from him. The way is through the person and work on the cross of Jesus Christ, who received our punishment that we deserved. Verses 18 through 20. Then the king answered and said to the woman, "Please do not hide from me anything that I ask you." And the woman said, "Please let my lord the king speak." So the king said, "Is the hand of Joab with you in all this?" And the woman answered and said, "As you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right hand or to the left from anything that my lord the king has spoken. For your servant Joab commanded me, and he put all these words in the mouth of your servant. To bring about the change of affairs, your servant Joab has done this thing. But my Lord is wise, according to the wisdom of the angel of God, to know everything that is in the earth. In the hand of Joab, is the hand of Joab with you in all this? And David somehow knew that a plan this subtle had to come from the hand of Joab. He put all the words in the mouth of your maidservant. And Joab orchestrated this with precision. He knew exactly what strings to pull in David. Joab was loyal to David, but it was not a selfless loyalty. And then we go to 21 through 24. And the king said to Joab, "All right, I've gathered this or granted this thing. Go therefore, bring back the young man Absalom." Then Joab fell to the ground on his face and bowed himself and thanked the king. And Joab said, "Today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, my lord, O king, in that the king has fulfilled the request of his servant." So Joab arose and went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. And the king said, "Let him return to his own house, but do not let him see my face." So Absalom returned to his own house, but did not see the king's face. Bring back the young man Absalom. Joab got what he wanted and what he thought was best for the nation of Israel. He hoped that Absalom's reconciliation with David would prevent a rebellion. Let him return to his own house, but do not let him see my face. David was overindulgent with his sons in the past, as when he got angry but did nothing against Amnon in 2 Samuel 13:21, when he raped his sister Tamar. Now David is too harsh with Absalom, refusing to see him after he had been exiled in Geshur for 3 years. See 2 Samuel 13:38. When parents don't discipline properly from the beginning, they tend to overcompensate in the name of toughness. Now, this often provokes the children to wrath, Ephesians 6:4, and makes the parent-child relationship even worse. 2 Samuel 14:25 through 27. Now In all Israel, there was no one who was praised as much as Absalom for his good looks. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And when he cut his hair of his head at the end of the year, he cut it because it was heavy on him. When he cut it, he weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels, according to the king's standard. To Absalom were born 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. She was a woman of beautiful appearance. So in all of Israel, there was no one who was praised as much as Absalom for his good looks. Now this begins to explain why Absalom was popular in Israel. Israel was attracted to King Saul because he was a very good-looking man. 1 Samuel 9:2. Absalom was also a man of political destiny. He was the 3rd son of David, 2 Samuel 3:2-5. The firstborn son, Amnon, was gone, and we hear nothing more of Chileab, the second-born. It's likely that Absalom was now the crown prince, the next in line for the throne. He weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels. So Absalom had such a great head of hair that he cut off 5.5 pounds of it every year. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration there. He was extremely proud of his long hair, and he lost his life because of it, as we will see later in 2 Samuel. 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. So Absalom was a man of deep and sympathetic feeling. He memorialized his wronged sister Tamar by naming his daughter after her. 2 Samuel 28, this is verses 28-32. Absalom is refused an audience with the king. And Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem, but did not see the king's face. Therefore, Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but he would not come to him. And when he sent again the second time, he would not come. So he said to his servants, "See, Joab's field is near mine, and he has barley there. Go set it on fire." And Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab arose and came to Absalom's house and said to him, "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" And Absalom answered, "Joab, look, I sent to you saying, 'Come here, so that I may send you to the king to say, why have I come to Geshur? I would be better off for me if I were still, it would be better for me to be there still. Now, therefore, let me see the king's face. But if there is iniquity in me, let him execute me." Now, Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem, but did not see the king's face. During these 2 years, we can imagine that Absalom grew more and more bitter against David. He was reconciled, but only partially. David offered only a partial but incomplete reconciliation. Absalom was banished from Israel because he murdered his brother Amnon in 2 Samuel 13. Yet Absalom felt entirely justified in killing the man who raped his sister. His sense of justification made the bitterness against David even more intense. "Joab's field is near mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." Frustrated that he could not see his father, Absalom burnt Joab's field to get his attention. Now, this shows us how brutal and amoral Absalom was. It's hard to think of a greater contrast than that between Absalom and the prodigal son of Jesus' parable. The prodigal son came back humble and repentant. Absalom came back burning Joab's field. At the same time, sometimes God gets our attention by setting our barley field on fire. He, knowing that we will not come by any other way, means he sends a serious trial our way. He sets our barley field on fire, which he has the right to do, seeing our barley fields are far more his than they are ours. That's a comment by Charles Spurgeon. If there is any iniquity in me, let him execute me. Now, this statement reflects Absalom's sense that he was fully justified in what he did. Verse 33. So Joab went to the king and told him, and when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king. Then the king kissed Absalom. So Joab went to the king and told him, as brutal and amoral as Absalom was, it worked. Burning Joab's field got his attention and made Joab intercede on Absalom's behalf. He came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground. Absalom outwardly submits to David, but David's 2-year refusal to reconcile left a legacy of bitterness in Absalom that turned out badly for David, for Absalom, and for Israel. Then the king kissed Absalom, and David offered Absalom forgiveness without repentance or resolution of the wrong. In personal relationships, it is often a sign of love and graciousness to overlook a wrong. Proverbs 10:12 says, hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all sins. But as king of Israel, this was more than a personal matter with David. He was the chief judge of Israel, and David excused and overlooked Absalom's obvious crimes. He should have kicked him rather than not have hardened him to further villainy, a comment by John Trapp. David's forgiveness of Absalom was completely inadequate, leading to a further outbreak of sin, as we will see later in 2 Samuel. God's forgiveness of man's soul is completely adequate and a great deterrent to continued sin. A comment by Ellen Redpath. May God write it on your soul if the pardon you want is that God should wink at your sin. He will not do it. Also by Redpath. And that's the end of chapter 14. We will go through verse 6 of chapter 15 and Absalom's deceptive takeover and what he did there. After this, it happened that Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. Now Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. So it was whenever anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision that Absalom would call to him and say, "What city are you from?" And he would say, "Your servant is from such and such tribe of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your case is good and right. There is no deputy of the king to hear you." Moreover, Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were made judge in the land and that everyone who has any suit or cause would come to me. Then I would give him justice. And so it was, whenever anyone came near to bow down to him, that he would put out his hand and take him and kiss him. In this manner, Absalom acted toward all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Chariots, horses, and 50 men to run before him. This means that Absalom didn't want the chariot for speed, but to make an impressive procession. This was Absalom, the politician, sensing what the people wanted and knowing how to give them the image of it. Samuel, who anointed Absalom's father, never went around with horses and chariots and an entourage. Samuel traveled on foot, and as a man, Absalom wasn't worthy of being mentioned in the same breath with Samuel. Whenever anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision, so ancient kings were more than heads of government. They were also the supreme court of the kingdom. If someone believed that a local court did not give them justice, they then appealed to the court of the king, where the king or a representative of the king would hear their case. Your case is good and right, but there is no deputy of the king to hear you. Absalom stirred up dissatisfaction with David's government and campaigned against David by promising to provide justice that David supposedly denied the people. Oh, that I were made judge in the land, I would give him justice. Absalom had reason to be delusioned with David's administration of justice. When Amnon raped Tamar, David did nothing. When Absalom did something about it, David banished Absalom and kept him at a distance, even when he came back. Whenever anyone came near to bow down to him, that he would put out his hand and take him and kiss him. Absalom was skilled at projecting a man of the people image, so to speak. In an obvious display, he wouldn't let others bow down to him, but would lift them up, shake their hand, and embrace them. From what we know of Absalom, we can guess that he really didn't consider himself a man of the people at all. He regularly acted as if he knew he was better looking, better connected, better off, and had better political instincts than most anyone. But these political instincts made Absalom know that he had to create an image of a man of the people. In ancient Israel, they were too easily impressed by image and too slow to see or appreciate the reality behind the image. Since the days of ancient Israel, we have only become more impressed by image over reality. Nothing has changed. If anything, it's gotten worse. Image is the most important thing for a politician these days. Absalom appeared to be the real and was the undisputed heir to the throne. David could not, in the course of nature, live very long, and most people are most disposed to hail the beams of the rising than to exult in those of the setting sun. That's a comment by Adam Clark. Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Absalom's cunning campaign worked. He became more popular and more trusted than David. Absalom knew exactly how to do this. He carefully cultivated an exciting, enticing image, chariots and horses, 50 men to run before him. He worked hard. Absalom would rise early. He knew where to position himself beside the way to the gate. He looked for troubled people, anyone who had a lawsuit. He reached out to troubled people. Absalom would call to them. He took a personal interest in troubled people. What city are you from? He sympathized with the person. Your case is good and right. He never attacked David directly. No deputy of the king to hear you. He left the troubled person a little more troubled by saying, no deputy of the king to hear you. Without directly attacking David, Absalom promised to do better. Oh, that I were made judge in the land, and everyone who has a suit or a cause would come to me. Then I would give them justice. Absalom's clever approach made him able to subvert and divide David's kingdom without saying any specific thing that could condemn him. If someone objected, Absalom would simply say, tell me one specific thing that I've said or done. In fact, Absalom could do all this and say, I'm helping David to deal with all this discontent, while Absalom was, in fact, promoting discontent. David was Israel's greatest king, and Israel became dissatisfied with him and let a wicked, amoral man steal their hearts. There are many reasons why this happened. David was getting older. David's sins diminished his standing, mainly like his sin with Bathsheba and the killing of Uriah. People liked change, and Absalom was exciting. Absalom was very skilled and cunning. David had to enter into the fellowship of his sufferings and be rejected like the son of David would later be rejected. Behold, a king, the greatest that ever lived, a profound politician, an able general, a brave soldier, a poet of the most sublime genius and character, a prophet of the Most High God, and the deliverer of his country, driven from his dominions by his own son, abandoned by his fickle people. And that's a comment by Adam Clarke. Now, we might say that Absalom's greatest sin was impatience. Absalom seemed to stand nearest to the throne, but his sin was that he sought it during his father's life and endeavored to dethrone him in order to sit in his stead. Also a comment by Adam Clarke. That's the end of our lesson today. We have some lessons and principles that I will put on the screen, and we will go over. Number 1, David and Absalom, estranged relationship, remained deadlocked because neither of them had the spiritual incentive to break it. Never let that happen in your family. Be the one that takes the initiative to reconcile any estranged relationship. See Luke 15:11 through 32. And that comes from 2 Samuel 14:1 through 3. And number 2, we will surely die and become like water spilled on the ground. There is urgency in reconciliation. After death, the opportunity has passed. The same holds true for our relationship with Jesus Christ. Do it now. Tomorrow may be too late. 2 Samuel 14:12 through 17. And number 3, Joab knew exactly what strings to pull in David, and David knew all this must come from Joab. If you have a friend that knows you that well, and you know the friend the same, you are truly blessed. Cherish that relationship and keep it alive, even if you are physically apart. 2 Samuel 14:18 through 20. And number 4, David goes from one extreme to the other. He is too indulgent with Amnon and too harsh with Absalom by refusing to see him. When parents don't discipline properly in the beginning, they tend to overcompensate in the name of toughness. See Ephesians 6:4. And that comes from 2 Samuel 14:21 through 24. And number 5, well, I keep going too far. David's forgiveness of Absalom was totally inadequate, leading to a further outbreak of sin. God's forgiveness of man's soul is completely adequate and serves as a great deterrent to sin. 2 Samuel 14:33. In number 6, we see in Absalom's example that ancient Israel was easily impressed by image and too slow to see the reality behind the image. We in America are guilty of the same thing, whether it be a political leader or a spiritual leader. We must learn to look past the image and recognize the true heart of the person. 2 Samuel 15:1 through 6. And next week, Absalom, 2 Samuel 15:7 is where we will pick up. Absalom plans the overthrow of David's kingdom. And just a note here, if you wish a hard copy of these lessons and principles, if you log into our website, hilltoplakechapel.org, and go to, resources, I think, and our ministries, one of the two, and you'll find the pastor's class. You go to the pastor's class, and there's a copy of all the videos there. And to the right of the link for the video is a link to a PDF of the lessons and principles for each video. So hope to join you next week. Hope you join us next week as we continue with our study of 2 Samuel. Thank you for being here. And I'm sorry about the broadcast this morning, but we will hopefully have that straightened out next week. And we look forward to seeing you there with us. Thank you and good evening.